Hi everyone! New video about floats. In this video I would like to tell you something about floats and how we can use floats to shade or highlight with acrylics. I want to start by saying that there are different ways of floating colors. Of course, there are some things that we need to keep in mind and that are the same for every method. But anyhow, there's not just one single way of floating colors. For example, some people use an angular brush, some people use a flat brush. Some people use the mop brush and some people don't use it. So there's not a technique that's the best. I've tried different ways over the years, and in this video I would like to show you the method that works the best for me. As I mentioned before, there are some important things that we need to keep in mind regardless of the method that we decide to use. So since they are so important, I decided to split the video in two parts. One is theory and one is practice. So let's start with the theory. Alright, so I drew three basic shapes here. We have a triangle, a kind of square, and a circle. And this can be an example of many elements that we get to paint because the triangle can be a Christmas tree or another kind of tree, or also a hat. The square can be a house or a vase, and the circle can be the face of a snowman or of a doll, or also a kind of fruit like cherries. As I mentioned before, there are some important things regardless of the method that we decide to use for floating, and one is the position of light, because everything starts from there. This is something that has already been decided by me or by another artist. In the painting instructions, you always have the picture of the finished piece and also the instructions telling you where to shade or to highlight. But you always have to keep in mind where the light comes from. Other important things are giving the right shape to our elements and also giving the right dimension. In my packets, when I tell you to shade, I usually tell you to use 2 or more colors for floating. So if we go back to our basic shapes, let's suppose that the light comes from here. So our sun is at the top right of our element. So I would tell you to shade the left side and the bottom of the element. So the first float needs to be wide, because first of all it helps you giving the right dimension to the element, and second, you need to have space to add other colors for the second or third float. For example, here I have a wide float because I need to have the space to add the second float that will cover a smaller area, and in case I could also add a third one that could cover an even smaller area. In this case, since the light comes in this direction, the corner of my element needs to be the darkest area. So what I would do is I would start directly from the corner, because this is when I have more paint on my brush. So I would start from here and then walk my float away from the corner. If you prefer, you can also do one side first, and then when dry do the second one. But the most important thing you have to do is you always need to look at the picture that's in the instructions packets, and always make sure that the darkest area in the picture is the darkest area that you have on your project. Giving the right shape and dimension to your elements makes your project come to life. But if you want your painting to be more realistic, you need to make sure to have a gradual look of your floating, and you can achieve that, as I told you before, by floating with a wide float at the beginning, so that you have the space to add a second float or even a third float if you want. But last but not the least, corners are extremely important when we talk about realistic look, because when we float, we need to round the corners of our element. In this case, for example, we can have a float that's gradual, and this is great, but if we keep this corner here, our element will always look flat. So if we want to achieve a realistic look, we need to round the corners for every float that we make. The first, the second, the third, for every single float we need to round the corners. Okay, so before starting with the practice section, I want to show you what you need. You need a water tub, and as you can see, this tub is divided in two parts. This part has a kind of grid at the bottom so that you can clean the brush while you're working, and this side doesn't have it, so you'll always have, let's say, the dirty water on this side and the clean water on this side. Then you need some paper towel to absorb the excess water from your brushes. You'll need also some paper palette to actually prepare your floats. Of course, we need to have paint, and I use the DecoArt Americana acrylics. And last but not the least, we need our brushes. The brush for the floating, as I told you before, can be angular or flat, and we can also use the mop brush that can be of this type or this type here. Personally, I've tried different types and brands of brushes, but I have to tell you that my favorite brush for floating is this one by Dynasty, and the series is Black Gold. And I love this brush because it has a lot of hair, so it's really thick, and this helps me in holding the right amount of water and paint that I need to float with. While regarding the mop brush, the basic difference is that with a mop like this, when we use it, we wipe the brush back and forth like this to dry the excess water. I actually began with this mop here, but then I realized I had less control of the brush, so I changed, and I started using this one. I haven't stopped using this one actually, but I use this only when I have to shade, for example, really wide areas. For example, if I have to shade like a frame or the edges of a background, or for example when I antique my pieces I always antique my work pieces when I'm done, and this brush helps me in really soften the shade by wiping the color back and forth. But usually when I paint and when I need to float colors for shading or highlighting my elements, I use this kind of mop here. And the difference compared to the other one is that in this case you soften the float from the water line to the paint. So from from the area where there's no paint to the area where you have paint, and you soften the color doing this. And this brush actually gives me more control because I can put the color exactly where I want to, but I'll show you this better later on. Regarding the brush that we actually use to float, as I told you before, there's not the best brush. I mean, you can use either the flat brush or the angular brush, but one thing you need to keep in mind, you always have your hair of the brush down. Probably with the flat brush this is easier because the hair are all the same length, but anyhow, even if you use an angular brush, you have to keep in mind that all the hair must be down, so you need to hold the brush like this and not like this. So like, I hope you can see it properly, but anyhow you need to press like this and not like this. Otherwise, I show you what happens. If I prepare my float correctly, I put the color on the first half of the brush, so I keep the color on the toe of the brush, and I don't know how this is called, probably tail, or I have no idea, but this is clean. And if I have all my hair down and I press and I prepare my float, what I have is I have a gradual look of my float, and I have a wide float. So when I go on my piece, on my surface, this is what I will have. So a gradual look from a lot of paint to no paint. And if I don't prepare my brush properly, so I always have the color on the toe of the brush, but I don't have all the hair down, so I hold the brush like this, so the tail of the brush is up. This is what I get. So when I go on my piece and I do the same, what I have is just a line. So I won't have the gradual look of my floating. So either if you use an angular brush or if you use a flat brush, always have your hair down. Alright, so let's try to put everything I told you so far into practice finally. One of the most important thing is how you prepare the color on your brush. So really take the time to do this step, because what you see in your paper palette is actually what you're gonna have on your piece. So always make sure to take the right time to do this this step. The method of floating color that I use has 3 brushes. The first one is a regular brush. just a flat brush, can also be an old brush that you have, and it helps me glistening the surface with water. The second one is the brush I use to float color, and I use a flat brush. And third one is the mop brush. The mop is the only brush that always remains dry. So of course when you finish painting you wash the brush with all the others, but while you're working it has to remain dry. Alright, so I want to start preparing the paint on my brush. Usually I would wet the area first, but I'm afraid that the water could dry, so I want to show you how I prepare my float first. Right now I'm going to shade the left and the bottom of my vase. So if you remember what I told you before about the first float, I'm gonna do a wide float so that then I can have the space to add the second one. And I will need to round the corners of my float. So let's start now. I'm going to shade with this dark blue. This is a very dark blue for this base coat. I don't think I would use it, but I really want you to see the difference between the two colors so that you can see the float properly. So I take my floating brush with some water and I remove the excess water by doing this 2 or 3 times. And I don't want to have too much water on this brush because I will wet my area first. So I prefer to have color instead of water here. Now I take the paint on my brush, on the half of my brush like this. And what I do is I start preparing my float, and as you can see all my hair are down and they're almost bent. So I start preparing my float, and I hope you can see it, but I have a kind of ridge of paint here on the left side. So what I do is I go over this ridge of paint because I want to use this paint. I want to have it on my brush instead of my palette. So as you can see, I have a gradual look here. So I know that I prepared my brush properly. And keep in mind that the other side of the brush always needs to be clean. So just in case, if you're not sure, just pinch this side a little bit with your fingers and then you're good to go. Then I take the brush that I use to wet the surface and I take some water and then I take the water away, doing this on my paper towel. And what I do now is I glisten the surface like that, and always make sure you don't have a kind of ocean here. It always needs to be only a glisten, so if you lift your surface you must have no drops moving around. So you just glisten the surface like this, and I start always from the corner, so, and I press because here I want to have more paint, and then I walk away my float like so. So I don't make a straight line, I just walk away the float like this, and then I round my corner like so, and then I go on the other side. And as you can see, the float is not perfect now because you can see all these kind of brush marks, but I don't care because as long as I have my barrier of water, my mop brush can do his job. So what I do now is I start from the water line, so from the area where I have no paint, and I start taking all my brush marks away, and I also soften my float. Always starting from the outside, and you move to the paint. And of course, while you're working, your mop is gonna pick up some water and some paint. So what you do is you go on a moist area of your paper towel and you clean the brush, and then you take some water away on a dry side, and then if you need to, you continue. Just always make sure you don't go over like so, but in case you do, don't worry, because you can always take your brush that's clean in this case, and then you can take all this away. While for the snowman, I'm going to shade this side of his face. In this case, I don't have the corner like I had here, but what I will do is, since I want this side to be the darkest one, I will press more on the hair of the brush, and I will decrease the pressure while I'm walking away from this area here. So in this case, I will use a little lighter blue, which is always too dark for this base coat, but I want to make sure you can see properly. So again, I take my floating brush and I take the water away. Then I take the color on the half of the brush and I prepare my float like so, and I go over that ridge of paint. Then I take my my other brush and I take the water away like so, and I glisten the surface again. Always make sure you don't have too much water here. And now I'm going to have less pressure and then pressure, and I can do it again to make it really white, and then less pressure again. So pressure here and less pressure. And the float is not perfect again, but I don't care because I have my mop brush, and then from the water line, so from where there's no paint to where you have paint, you do like so. And I had to clean the brush a little bit. And then I soften everything, and my brush marks are gone. So I have this side that's the darkest one. Okay, so now we have to do the second float, that, as I told you before, always has a darker color compared to the first float. Of course, when we are talking about shading. But anyhow, it always covers a smaller area compared to the first one. So I'm going to float now with lamp black here, and I'm using lamp black just because this is really dark now, so I want you to be able to see the float I'm doing. And all the steps are the same as the previous float. So I'm going to take the color on my brush and I'm going to prepare my float as I did before. So I go over that ridge of paint until I get a gradual look. Then I glisten the surface again, and I always start from the corner, but this time I'm going to cover a smaller area. And again, with my mop brush, I start from the water line, so where there's no paint, to where I have paint. And I have, oops, anyhow, I have my second float. And I made a little mess here, but yeah, I can take all the black away, like so. While for the snowman, I can use this dark blue, and I'll do the same. So when you do floats in smaller areas, you can also use smaller brushes if you prefer. So for example, I could use these two sizes here if you feel more, let's say, comfortable with that. And I always take the paint on the brush like this, and I always prepare my float, always go over the ridge of paint, glisten the surface again, and then I press where I want to have more color, and then I decrease the pressure if I move, when I walk away my float. And with my smaller mop, always from the area where you have no paint to the area where you have paint. And you can move the paint exactly where you want. And now we have a stronger float here. And sometimes we also need to do narrow or thin floats. In this case, I prefer to use smaller brushes because I feel more comfortable with that, and I feel I have more control of the brush. So the basic difference is how we prepare the color on the brush. And I mean, if if we want to do narrow floats, we need to take the color on the brush like all the times. But in this case, when we prepare the floats, we push that ridge of paint. So for the white float, I went over the ridge of paint, while for the narrow float, I push the ridge of paint away. And I never go on top of it. In this case, I have all my paint here. So I can always, of course, I wet the surface and I do my float again, always starting from the corner and rounding my corner, but this time I have a thin float because all the paint is on the tip of my brush. And I use the smaller mop and I soften everything. On the snowman again, we would need to have a thin float under the hat. So I prepare my brush again for the thin float. So I take the color on my brush, and when I prepare the brush, I push that ridge of paint away and I press on the hair of the brush so that the ridge of paint is all on one side. And I glisten the surface again. And here I can round the corner because I'm on one side of his face. And I round the corner again. So as you can see, we have two different floats, and this depends on how we prepare the color on our brush. Alright, so I finished shading the face of the snowman and this part of the vase. Of course, highlights are also important to bring our elements to life, so probably I will do another video for that. There's one last thing I want to tell you. This might seem simple to do, but I found out it's not. Especially having students over the years, I realized that people forget to do this really simple thing. And I mean, take enough paint on your brush. Some people always tell me they don't want to take enough paint because they don't want the color to get wasted. But this is actually one way to waste the paint, because if you don't get enough paint on your brush, so let's suppose I take this really tiny amount, what happens is that when you prepare the paint on your brush, you can also prepare the paint really good, but if it's not enough, what happens is that when you go on your piece, you have nothing left because everything is here. So you end up doing your floats over and over again, and that's when you waste paint. So don't be afraid of paint. It's not gonna hurt you or anything, so use it. Okay, so I tried to tell you what are the most important things for me about floating. Remember that shading and highlighting is what brings your work to life, so they are the basics of painting. It's actually also what you will do the most, so you can practice a lot. I hope this video will help you, so let me know in the comments if you liked it or what you think about it. And you can also subscribe to my channel if you want. You can find all my designs on my website, and on my website there are also some free projects to download if you want to practice. You can also find me on social media, so get in touch with me if you want to watch other videos or if you have any questions, because if I can, I will be happy to help you guys. So bye for now, and I'll see you next time. Bye!